There is an ancient truth in the game of empires that Washington seems to have completely forgotten. You cannot seize a country's resources and call it liberation. You cannot kidnap a president and call it law enforcement. And you cannot bomb a sovereign nation and expect the rest of the world to applaud your virtue. What the United States just did in Venezuela was not a victory. It was a confession. It was a confession that the American empire has reached the point of desperation where it must abandon all pretense of the rules-based order it spent 80 years building. On January 3, 2026, at approximately 2 a.m. local time, the skies over Caracas erupted. More than 150 American military aircraft thundered across Venezuelan airspace. Explosions rocked the capital. The lights of the city flickered and died as American forces demonstrated what Trump later called a certain expertise in disabling critical infrastructure. Within 30 minutes, a ground team extracted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife from their fortified compound inside Fuerte Tiuna, the nation's largest military complex. By dawn, Maduro was on board the USS Iwo Jima, heading to New York to face charges of narco-terrorism. President Trump stood before the cameras at Mar-a-Lago, declaring it one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might in history. He announced that the United States would run the country until further notice. But here is what Trump did not tell you. Here is what the American media conveniently forgot to mention. Just hours before that raid, Maduro was sitting across the table from China's special envoy for Latin American affairs. They were reaffirming their strategic partnership. They were talking about oil exports. They were building what Maduro called a multipolar world of development and peace. The timing was not coincidental. It was a message. And that message was not sent by Washington. It was sent to Washington. Because what happened in Venezuela is not simply a military operation. It is the final unraveling of the post-World War II order. It is the moment where the United States declared to the world that international law is optional, that sovereignty is negotiable, and that any nation sitting on resources America wants should start looking over their shoulder. But in making this declaration, Washington has handed China its greatest diplomatic victory in the Western Hemisphere. They have validated every argument Beijing has ever made about American hypocrisy, and they have accelerated the collapse of the very financial system that keeps the American economy breathing. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand what Venezuela actually represents on the global chessboard. Forget the politics for a moment, forget Maduro, forget the accusations of drug trafficking and election fraud. Look at the geology. Venezuela is sitting on approximately 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That makes it the largest petroleum repository on the planet. It is larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran, larger than Canada and Iraq combined. Nearly 18% of all the oil on Earth lies beneath Venezuelan soil. Most of this oil is concentrated in a region called the Orinoco Belt, a massive formation stretching 600 kilometers across the country's central interior. The United States Geological Survey estimates this single region could contain up to 1.4 trillion barrels of heavy crude in total deposits. But here is the critical detail that changes everything. Venezuela's oil is not like Saudi Arabia's oil. It is not the light, sweet crude that flows easily and refines cheaply. Venezuela produces heavy, sour crude. It is thick, viscous, and packed with sulfur. It requires specialized refineries to process. Crucially, the massive refineries along the American Gulf Coast were built 50 years ago specifically to process this type of heavy crude. When the United States talks about energy independence, they conveniently omit this detail. Yes, America produces a massive amount of oil from its shale formations, but that oil is light. The American industrial machine was designed to run on the thick sludge from the Orinoco. For decades, this created a perfect symbiosis. Venezuela pumped, America refined, everyone profited. But then came the nationalizations, the sanctions, and eventually, China. The relationship between Beijing and Caracas is not a recent development. It was cultivated deliberately over 2 decades as part of China's grand strategy to secure resource access across the global south. In 2001, Venezuela became the first Hispanic nation to sign a strategic development partnership with China. Since then, China has extended nearly $60 billion in state loans to Venezuela. Most of these loans were structured as oil for financing agreements. Venezuela received the capital it desperately needed, and China received guaranteed oil shipments and established a foothold in America's backyard. China National Petroleum Corporation, the state-owned energy giant, established joint ventures with Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA. The most significant of these was formed to develop the extra-heavy crude deposits of the Orinoco Belt. This was China securing direct access to the largest oil reserves on the planet. They built specialized facilities capable of processing the heavy, sulfurous Venezuelan oil that other nations could not handle efficiently. They created the infrastructure. They trained the personnel. They made themselves indispensable. And then, in May 2024, China and Venezuela signed an investment protection and promotion agreement. This established a formal legal framework protecting Chinese companies operating in Venezuela, ensuring their assets would be safeguarded regardless of political changes. Beijing was preparing for exactly the scenario that just unfolded. When American forces captured Maduro, they walked into a country where China has established deep commercial roots. They seized a leader who hours earlier was meeting with Chinese diplomats, and they created a crisis that, regardless of how it resolves, serves Beijing's strategic interests. Consider the immediate aftermath. China's foreign ministry issued a statement describing the operation as deeply shocking. They called it a violation of the UN Charter. But look past the diplomatic language. Listen to what China did not say. Beijing did not threaten military retaliation. They did not announce sanctions. Instead, Chinese officials emphasized their intention to maintain positive communication and cooperation with whoever ends up governing Venezuela. This is not weakness. This is strategic patience. China understands something that Washington apparently does not. You do not need to control the government to control the resources. You need to control the infrastructure, the shipping lanes, the refining capacity, and the financial relationships that make resource extraction profitable. Meanwhile, the United States is now stuck managing a country of 30 million people with no clear exit strategy. They have removed Maduro, but his entire government structure remains in place. Trump suggested the U.S. would run the country for an indefinite period. But what does that actually mean? It means responsibility for an economy that has contracted by 75% over the past decade. It means providing electricity, clean water, and basic services to a population that has seen 6 million of its citizens flee abroad. China gets to watch this unfold from a comfortable distance, offering assistance, maintaining relationships, and waiting for the inevitable moment when Washington discovers that occupying a country is far more expensive than invading one. The global reaction to the Venezuela operation reveals something profound about where America now stands in the international order. The coalition that condemned this action included some of Washington's closest regional partners. Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, issued one of the most forceful condemnations. President Lula called the operation an unacceptable line that had been crossed. He warned it represented the first step toward a world of violence and chaos, where the law of the strongest prevails. Mexico's president stated that the strikes breached the UN Charter. Colombia, Chile, and Uruguay joined in. These are democracies. These are countries that trade heavily with the United States, and yet they united in condemnation. Why? Because they are terrified. They are asking the obvious question: if the United States can indict a foreign leader, build up military forces under the guise of counter-narcotics, and then launch a full-scale assault to capture that leader, who is next? What happens if Brazil decides to price its soybeans in yuan? What happens if Saudi Arabia decides to sell oil exclusively for gold? Does the 82nd Airborne show up in Riyadh? This fear is the fuel that drives de-dollarization. And this is where China wins the real war. For years, China has positioned itself as an alternative to American-led institutions. Through BRICS, through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing has been constructing parallel systems that reduce dependence on the dollar-dominated financial architecture Washington controls. The Venezuelan crisis has handed China the most powerful validation of this strategy imaginable. Every speech Xi Jinping has ever delivered about American hegemony has just been proven correct in the most dramatic fashion possible. The statistics on de-dollarization tell a story that should terrify American policymakers. Central banks worldwide added over 1,000 metric tons of gold to their reserves in 2024, the third consecutive year of massive purchases. China and Russia now conduct most of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. Brazil and China signed a direct trade settlement agreement. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting yuan for oil sales. The BRICS bloc now includes nations responsible for roughly 40% of global petroleum output. What the United States has just demonstrated to every one of these nations is that holding dollar assets is a vulnerability, not a strength. American promises of security are conditional on obedience. The only protection from American power is to build systems that operate outside American reach. China's cross-border interbank payment system now links nearly 5,000 banks across 185 countries. These are the escape routes that the Global South is rapidly constructing. The Venezuela operation did not slow this exodus, it accelerated it. The tactical brilliance of the military operation itself cannot be denied. It was a technical masterpiece. But military competence is not the same as strategic wisdom. The United States has proven its dominance in kinetic warfare is unmatched, but it has also proven that it no longer cares about the careful diplomatic architecture that kept great power competition from descending into chaos for 80 years. The precedent has been established. A powerful nation can now simply take what it wants. China does not need to say this out loud. They simply need to remain the alternative. They need to continue offering loans without political conditions. They need to maintain investments regardless of who governs. They need to demonstrate that partnership with Beijing does not come with the threat of midnight raids and regime change. The irony is almost too perfect. The United States launched this operation to secure access to Venezuela's oil and counter Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. The result will be to confirm every suspicion about American intentions and accelerate the very realignment Washington sought to prevent. American oil majors are unlikely to commit the capital required for reconstruction without extraordinary guarantees. They remember the nationalizations. They know that any investment they make could be swept away by the next government. Meanwhile, China has already built the relationships, the infrastructure, and the institutional knowledge to operate in Venezuela's challenging environment. The most likely outcome is not an American renaissance in Venezuelan oil. It is continued dependence on Chinese expertise and Chinese capital. International law experts have been unequivocal in their assessment. The strike qualifies as a crime of aggression under international law, but international law only matters if it is enforced. And who enforces international law against the nation that controls the enforcement mechanisms? This is the question the Global South is answering by building parallel institutions. The lessons of Venezuela will be studied for decades. Military academies will analyze the raid. Diplomatic schools will examine the unraveling of regional alliances. But economics departments will trace the accelerating collapse of the dollar back to this moment, when the United States abandoned all pretense of operating within rules. For China, the victory is not in Venezuela itself. It is in the validation of their worldview. It is in the demonstration that American partnership comes with strings attached to chains attached to bombs. It is in the quiet conversations happening right now in capitals from Riyadh to Brasilia, where leaders are reconsidering who they can trust. The United States wanted to isolate Venezuela. Instead, by acting with such brazen disregard for international norms, they have isolated themselves. They have proven that strength without legitimacy is merely violence. China does not need to fire a single shot. They simply need to wait and build and offer an alternative. The era of uncontested American dominance did not end on January 3, 2026. It has been ending for years. But the operation in Venezuela will be remembered as the moment when the pretense finally collapsed. The emperor stopped pretending he had clothes. The world is watching, and the world is drawing its conclusions. The strategic petroleum reserve can be refilled. The refineries can be maintained. But trust, once destroyed, does not return. And an empire that rules only through fear eventually discovers that fear is the least reliable foundation of power.